The lights at Jimmy Kimmel Live studio seemed especially bright today, as if someone had deliberately turned them up to the max. The glare hit straight in the face, leaving a sensation of scorching iron above the eyes. The audience, as always, was packed, but the applause sounded different. Not lighter, not joyful, but tinged with tension, as if the crowd itself sensed they were sitting in a room with closed windows and a hidden anxiety in the air. Something hung over them, not just a celebrity guest, something bigger, something that could slip out of control. Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage in his usual manner, calm, slightly leaning forward, as if testing the weight of the stage beneath him. He didn't look at the audience, didn't seek out the cameras, didn't smile. He just walked. There was no pomp in his movements, but there was something you can't fake. A sense of a man who hadn't come as a guest, but as if to a courtroom, where everything said already carried weight. Not comedic. Real. He sat down, legs uncrossed, eyes not on the audience. In the chair, he wasn't resting. He was waiting. The camera shifted, framing the shot, and the host slid slightly to the side to avoid blocking the line of sight. Everything was ready. Almost. Kimmel was composed, as always, with his perfectly rehearsed half-smile that had worked flawlessly on thousands of guests before. He didn't need to think. His face moved on its own. Yet, something in him tightened when he looked at the man across from him. Too quiet, too steady. Not a single gesture to lean on. He started with a light joke, something about how Clint must be tired of being called a living legend, as it sounds like he's already in a museum. The audience reacted as scripted, laughter, applause, approval. But Clint didn't change. He didn't even nod. Kimmel pressed on. He mentioned the film, The Last Trail, a story about a war veteran who returns years later to a deserted town, only to realize he hasn't lost his country, but himself. The film is heavy, shot in black and white, without music. There's almost no dialogue. Just faces, just bodies, just the land no one remembers anymore. Clint began to speak. His voice was dry, like paper left in a drawer for decades. He didn't narrate. He declared. The film wasn't just a story. It was a diagnosis. The men he knew didn't just die. They were crushed by silence. They weren't allowed to speak. And when they did open their mouths, people looked at them like old furniture. The audience listened. They didn't breathe. Kimmel nodded, made interjections, stayed within the format. But you could feel it. He was searching for a moment. He was waiting for a chance to steer the show back into his hands, to put the smile back on track. And, as always, the moment came. He asked, not aggressively, but with the tone familiar to anyone who's seen hosts ride a wave. Isn't Clint's hero a reflection of that toxic masculinity everyone talks about? Silent, closed off, stubborn, incapable of dialogue. Isn't that exactly what society is desperately trying to move away from? The front rows froze. One person in the balcony exhaled too loudly. The camera operator's fingers tensed subtly on the focus knob. Eastwood turned his head, slowly. His eyes locked on Kimmel for a moment, as if taking aim. And then, no shouting, no anger, just heavy words, spoken slowly, with weight. He said that if society thinks men who've been through war are toxic, maybe the problem isn't the men, it's the society. The real poison is the memory they want to erase because it's inconvenient to live with. Toxicity is a word invented so no one has to be reminded of pain that can't be repackaged as a trend. The room seemed to sway. Some began to clap, single, insistent claps, breaking free on their own. Others leaned back in their seats, arms crossed. There was no laughter, only tension, like the moment before an explosion. Kimmel didn't falter. He made a soft pivot, brought up a scene in the film where the hero throws his medals into a river, asked if it wasn't an admission that the old system was wrong too. that maybe it's time to let go of past ideals. Clint answered immediately, bluntly, without pause. He said, "Ideals don't die. The people who can't hold on to them do. The hero doesn't throw away the medals. He throws away the illusion that service left him with anything. All he has is his back, which shouldn't carry anyone else's words, only scars and memory." Kimmel took a step back, not physically, but in tone. He slipped in another joke, something about things getting too philosophical and needing a bartender. No one laughed, just a couple of uncertain voices, unsure if it was even appropriate. Behind the scenes, producers started gesturing. The commercial break was approaching. An assistant signaled, 30 seconds left. Kimmel glanced at his cards, then the audience, then back at Eastwood. He didn't know what to say. And Clint just sat there, upright, like a monument. Except, unlike a monument, he wasn't done. When Kimmel finally opened his mouth to wrap the segment, Eastwood cut him off, not with his voice, but with a look. He said just one thing. "You're afraid of those who stay silent, because you know they're not silent for no reason." And the room fell quiet again. Not from fear, from the realization this wasn't even the beginning. The lights dimmed, the show cut to commercial, and something in the studio changed. The air felt different, like the calm before a storm you can't hide from or stop. The studio returned from the break, but no one was laughing. Even those who usually clapped on autopilot now seemed to be waiting for something. The cameras were live, but the atmosphere was like a courtroom before a verdict. The host forced a smile, slipping back into his role as if nothing had happened. He tossed out a light line, said it got a bit hot. Maybe the studio forgot to turn on the AC. A hollow chuckle. Empty. It bounced off the walls, failing to pierce the air. Clint Eastwood sat in the same position, back straight, gaze focused, not hostile, just firm, like a man who wasn't playing the game. He didn't blink more than necessary, didn't move his hands. His silence wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. It said more than most speeches on this show in years. Kimmel returned to the film, talked about a scene where the hero meets his son after 20 years apart. The scene is heavy, cold, no hugs, no explanations. Kimmel asked, "Wasn't the hero too cruel? Doesn't it reflect the problem of fathers too closed off to love?" Clint didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, as if weighing whether the truth was worth saying. Then he said his hero wasn't cruel. He just didn't want to lie. He couldn't say he missed his son because he didn't know what missing meant, when every day was a fight to breathe. He couldn't hug his son because he wasn't sure the boy would forgive hands stained with blood. Sometimes, silence is the only thing that doesn't destroy. The audience went still. In the control room, movement. Assistants exchanged glances. One, for the first time in many episodes, grabbed a walkie-talkie. It wasn't panic, it was readiness. The studio vibrated, like the air itself was trembling. No one shouted, but everyone was on edge. Kimmel pivoted. He mentioned that some critics called the film dangerous, that it romanticizes trauma, turns suffering into heroism, that it might make viewers, especially young ones, think being closed off, rough, distant, is a norm to aspire to. That maybe the film doesn't heal, it infects. Eastwood's face didn't change, he didn't move, just slightly turned his head toward the host. His voice dropped lower. He said, "There's nothing dangerous about the truth. What's dangerous is hiding it. Pretending everything can be fixed with soft words and group therapy. Forgetting that male pain isn't something to judge, it's a fact to acknowledge. Because if you ignore it, it turns into a weapon. And then, it's too late." The audience stirred. Some clapped, some didn't. A man in a black shirt in the front row craned his neck forward. A young woman beside him whispered to her friend. At the edge of the stage, security shifted position, not obviously, but enough for the operators to notice. Kimmel still smiled, but his eyes betrayed him. He felt control slipping away. He tried to sidestep, asked if creating the hero was about showing transformation, that maybe men like him didn't know how to speak before, but now they can. Now there's a language for pain, for feelings, for change. Clint answered fast. Too fast, like he'd been waiting for it. He said when pain becomes content, it's not language, it's betrayal. Not every wound needs to be shown on camera. Maybe a man who stays silent isn't silent because he can't speak, but because the world is already full of words that mean nothing. The room split again. Some clapped, sharply, defiantly. Others stayed silent, their quiet a judgment. The noise grew. Someone shouted, "Yes!" Someone shook their head. Cameras wavered. The director signaled, "Don't panic, just capture it." Kimmel swallowed. He knew a turning point was coming. If he didn't hold it, the show would slip away completely. He said, more tensely now, that it all sounded too grim. That it can't be true that people don't have the right to be different. That there's another model. Modern, humane. It's not worse. It's just new. Eastwood leaned back. His face stayed still, but something shifted in his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was deciding. He said new isn't always better. Humanity isn't measured by how many words you use. When a man is called toxic just for holding strong, that's not progress. It's humiliation. You can't build the new by destroying those who survived the old. The audience froze. Then, like a jolt of electricity, it erupted. Someone stood, clapping loudly. Another shouted, "Thank God someone said it!" Some walked out, not waiting for the end. The noise became uncontrollable. Cameras struggled to keep up with faces. Assistants were told to prep security for possible intervention. Kimmel wasn't smiling anymore. He sat, tense, hands on the desk, fingers clenched. He tried to interject, but the audience drowned him out. He said he respected Clint's view, but, pausing here, maybe it's worth admitting not everything from the past deserves a future. Clint leaned forward, spoke slowly. Maybe. But the past isn't a bag you can throw out. It's a foundation. Break it, and the house collapses. For a second, no one moved. The room held its breath. Then, another surge, louder, harsher. Producers waved frantically. The director yelled into his headset. Eastwood sat calmly. He knew what he'd said. He felt the room shake, but he didn't. As always, he was one against all. While everyone scrambled to exit the scene, he stayed in it until the end. The show cut to another commercial, but the chaos couldn't be hidden. And after the break, things would only get tougher. The studio returned to air, but there was no sense of coming back. The atmosphere didn't dissipate. It thickened, grew denser, as if the studio was shrinking with every minute, like a cage holding two predators. Cameras were back in action, but operators no longer panned smoothly. Each held focus like a weapon, unsure where the next shot would land. Kimmel returned to the desk. His smile now looked like a dusty mask no one had cleaned. He tried to diffuse the tension, said the show felt like a Pentagon interrogation, and if anyone's palms were sweating, they weren't alone. No laughter. A few timid chuckles, then nothing. The audience hadn't relaxed. They were waiting for the next blow. Eastwood didn't move. He sat as he had from the start, back straight, shoulders still, hands on the armrests. Only his eyes sharpened. They no longer held just weariness. There was defiance. Not at Kimmel. At the system, its packaging, its theater. Kimmel tried to shift the tone. He started talking about courage, not as a virtue, but as a construct. maybe it's time to rethink what it means to be a man. That heroism today isn't standing silent, but speaking openly, being vulnerable, admitting pain. He spoke smoothly, like a lecturer, but in his voice was fear. He knew he wasn't talking to a man, but to granite you can't chip with a thesis. Eastwood leaned forward slightly, very slowly. The movement became pressure. He looked at the host and said, "Vulnerability isn't crying on air. It's coming back from war and not being able to say a word to your wife. Not because you don't want to, but because if you start, you won't stop. Because it's not feelings, it's fire. And if you let it out, it burns everything." The room rumbled. Part of the audience clapped, standing. Others glared at them with anger. The divide became physical. The left side of the room, silent. The right, ablaze. Cameras darted. The director yelled in an operator's ear, "Hold the center! Don't lose the face!" Kimmel made an effort to regain control. He said he respected Eastwood's experience, but every generation has its own traumas. What was strength then might be weakness now. New times call for new answers. Clint responded instantly. His voice didn't rise. He didn't shout. But each word hit the studio floor like a soldier's boot. He said, "Answers change. Questions don't. Who are you when no one's watching? What do you carry when the world demands a smile? Who do you protect when you're at your limit?" The room exploded again. Not just claps, shouts. People stood, some clapping, others arguing. One producer grabbed a mic and signaled security, not to act yet, but to move closer to the stage. Two men in black appeared at the back stairs, subtle but in direct response range. Kimmel noticed the security shift. He saw the situation teetering. He went all in, asked Eastwood point blank, "Does he really think this whole new world is a mistake? That empathy, conversation, trying to be closer, is that weakness?" Clint answered without hesitation. He said empathy isn't weakness, but using it to ignore strength is a lie. Men today haven't become better. They've become convenient. And there's no pride in that, only anxiety. Chaos erupted. The room buzzed. Some shouted, "Keep going!" Others, "Get him off the stage!" One audience member pulled out a phone and stood on a chair. Security immediately asked them to sit. Cameras lost focus. Lights shifted. Kimmel raised his voice, trying to overpower the crowd. He said the show must go on. They could argue, but it didn't need to become a fight. Eastwood didn't break eye contact. He said this wasn't a fight. It was an autopsy. Shows like this had played on the surface too long. And now, when someone dug deeper, everyone was scared. One guard stepped closer, not aggressively, just closer. Kimmel noticed. He raised a hand. "Don't touch." But everything was already sliding. Clint continued. His voice was low, but each sound was steel. He said, "Truth isn't a talk show topic. It doesn't fit in a segment with ad breaks. This whole thing, a farce built on the fear that someone might say something you can't edit out." Kimmel, voice cracking, said, "It's just a show. People talk, argue, but don't hold court." Eastwood looked at him, long, and said, "Maybe it's time we did." Silence. Everything stopped. Cameras, lights, noise. In that moment, the quiet was louder than any siren, and everyone knew what came next couldn't be undone. The studio no longer felt like a studio. The lights too bright, the audience trapped under a dome with no exit. The air was taut, like a string, and no one knew whose move would snap it. Kimmel tried to pause. Said something about returning to the film, a scene at a train station where Eastwood's hero refuses to board, knowing no one's coming for him. He tried to pull the talk back to format, back to the show's banks, But Clint had already stepped beyond them and was pulling everyone else along. He looked at the host, eyes unwavering, said those are the scenes they don't want to show. No victory, no catharsis. Just a man who's held too much for too long to pretend now. Sometimes you stand on the platform and the train leaves without you. That's truth too. The audience didn't know how to react. Some clapped, others stayed silent, some argued among themselves. One shouted something. A camera lost focus for a second. An assistant waved, whispering to a producer. Security stood closer. One guard's hand rested on his belt, not threatening, just ready. Kimmel, smile gone, asked the audience to calm down. His voice cracked, but he fought for control. He turned to Clint and said, "Maybe it's just different views. They could agree to disagree." Eastwood leaned forward. His voice was a low rumble of thunder. He said, "Agree to disagree was invented by those afraid to lose face. Some things aren't just opinions. They're either true or false. And if you choose silence for comfort, you've already picked a side." Kimmel tried to counter, but the audience roared. Several stood, shouting, clapping. One producer signaled. Security moved in. The host saw it. He stood, hands up, asking them not to touch Eastwood, not to interfere. But Eastwood stood too. He did it slowly, like each move was his last in this scene. He didn't stand taller or broader, but his figure filled the frame. He looked at the audience, then the guards. No one moved. He said he didn't come to fight, or to humiliate anyone. He just couldn't stay silent anymore, because he'd seen what happens when those who should speak don't, and those who laugh don't even know what they're laughing at. One audience member yelled, "Then leave!" Another stood, clapping. Cameras caught faces, tears, anger, anticipation. Security stayed still. Phones lit up the dark. Kimmel stepped closer. Said it's a show and it has to go on. This wasn't the place for speeches. It should be a safe space for everyone. His voice broke. Eastwood looked at him. Said safety is an illusion if it's built on pretense. You can't demand truth and then cut to ads when it gets uncomfortable. You can't invite people for truth and expect them to stick to a script. The room erupted. Shouts, applause, dissent. Cameras shook. Producers yelled. The show was out of control. One guard stepped forward. Clint didn't move. He just looked. And that was enough to stop the guard. Eastwood turned, walked to the stage's edge. Slowly, each step like a bell tolling. At the exit, he stopped, turned, looked straight into the camera. He said, "The problem isn't that we're different. The problem is we're afraid to speak. Afraid we won't be understood, judged, shouted down. The problem isn't men or women. The problem is someone decided you can live without a spine and without truth." He looked at the audience. "I've done my part. I said what I had to say. The rest is yours." He walked off stage. The noise didn't stop. Kimmel stood frozen. For the first time in the show, he was speechless. The pause stretched. Then he looked at the camera. Said just one thing. "Well, there you have it. You saw it yourselves." The screen went black. If you're watching this on YouTube, we want to hear your opinion. Do you support Jimmy Kimmel, who tried to keep the show on track, even at the cost of silence? Or are you with Clint Eastwood, who broke the script to say what he believed needed saying? Who was right? Who crossed the line? And was there meaning in it? Write in the comments. We read everything.